Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Irvin. I'm a curator at the RISD Museum, and you've joined session 5C, which we have 5 wonderful presentations of individual papers on the theme of textiles and education. We will get started as soon as possible. I will announce the name and the title of the paper right before each speaker comes on. And I just want to remind everybody to please use the Q&A function for any questions, which we will address at the very end after all of the presentations. So let's begin. Our first speaker is Kelli Coles, and Kelli is presenting the paper Schoolgirl Embroideries and Black Girlhood in Antebellum, Philadelphia. Welcome, Kelli.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my ongoing research. I welcome any comments, questions, or suggestions that you may have as I present this, my work to you today. The well-taught philosophic mind to all compassion gives, casts round the world an equal eye, and feels for each that lives. 8-year-old Mary De Silva stitched this quote into a diminutive 6.5 by 6-inch marking sampler dated 1793. The sampler is a natural colored plain woven linen ground worked with silk threads of green, red, and blue, and is displayed in a wood frame not original to the piece. De Silva utilized cross and eyelet stitches throughout the verse, stitched in green silk. Stitched in red silk, the identification section of the sampler reads, wrought by Mary De Silva in the 8th year of her age, Negro School, Philadelphia, 1793. The verse and identification are surrounded by a zigzag border, an ancient design motif signifying night and day, the changing of the seasons or flowing water, according to needlework scholar Margaret Schiffer. The border was stitched utilizing cross or marking stitches in 2 shades of green silk. The verse worked on the sampler is very telling of the education De Silva received as a student. The verse is an excerpt from the 1772 poem, The Mouse's Petition, by British poet and essayist Anna Letitia Barbauld. In the poem, the author utilized the rhetoric of the abolitionist movement to criticize the divisions between rich and poor and nodded to the burgeoning anti-animal experimentation movement of the era. Whether De Silva selected this verse or her needlework teacher, I believe at 8 years old, witnessing the plight of Philadelphia's Black communities, this poem no doubt had an effect on her, as she most likely meditatively stitched its words with colorful silk threads into her linen canvas. We believe Mary De Silva was a student of the Associates of Dr. Bray's Negro School in the city of Philadelphia when she stitched this marking sampler. The school was established by a London-based Anglican organization as a co-educational institution for free and enslaved children of the city. And that goes to show their stance on slavery as well, I believe, in the fact that they cared for the education of the students, but not on their actual freedom. De Silva was a daughter of 2 free mulatto parents, Emmanuel De Silva and Judith Jones, according to the records of Christ Church, where they were married in 1783 and where Mary was baptized two years later in 1785 by Reverend William White. My brief introduction for you all today to Mary De Silva is one of the many stories I weave together on the education and needlework skills of enslaved and free Black girls and young women in the antebellum era. It begins during the formation of British North American colonies, when it was believed that no young woman was truly educated unless she had mastered the skills of housewifery and was, quote, proficient with the needle, unquote, according to Gloria Allen Seaman. This ideology of domesticity, in conjunction with the ideology of Republican motherhood, fervently upheld by the elite of white society, was not designed to be inclusive of young Black girls growing up, growing into womanhood as free citizens in society. Republican motherhood was a post-revolutionary ideology centered around how white women were to educate the members of their household to be constructive, dutiful members of the republic. According to Erica Armstrong Dunbar, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many women, poor, enslaved, indentured-free, and laboring in the Black community of Philadelphia, were also incorporating these values of Republican motherhood, including Christian piety, sobriety, and industry into their lives, but it was all shaped by race. For Black girls in the 18th and 19th centuries of the US, needlework knowledge could have also been a valued skill beneficial to becoming a self-employed seamstress to support herself and or her family, a seamstress in the house of a slave mistress or master, or as a hired domestic worker. De Silver likely first learned and honed needlework skills from her family and kin within the home. This would have been needlework knowledge passed down through the generations, brought with her ancestors, grandparents, or possibly parents across the Atlantic from their home villages and tribes from the mother continent of Africa. This familial knowledge was likely reinforced with the instruction of a needlework teacher in school. I begin with Mary De Silva's beautiful piece and would like to briefly introduce you to the only other known needlework embroideries created by Black girls living in Antebellum, Philadelphia. The embroideries of Adeline Harris in the center, who stitched her embroidered sampler in 1830 as a student of the Clarkson School, and Olivia Rebecca Parker to the right, who stitched her canvas embroidery in 1852 when she was a student at the Lombard Street School. Adeline Harris's sampler was a silk embroidery on linen ground. It is approximately 17¼ inches square. The sampler features a strawberry vine, 4 flower motifs with 4 birds in the corners, a verse, and a pastoral scene. The verse reads, a solitary blessing few can find. Our joys with those we love are intertwined. And he whose wakeful tenderness removes the obstructing thorn which wounds the friend he loves, smooths not another's rugged path alone, but scatters roses to adorn his own. And her signature line reads, Adeline Harris, Clarkson School, 10th month, 1st, 1830. The verse was from the essay, Sensibility, a poetical epistle to the Honorable Mrs. Boscawen. It was published within the 1782 Moral Guide of English poet, playwright, teacher, and philanthropist Hannah More. This verse spoke to the joy one feels when relieving a friend's pain or suffering, which was central to the abolitionist cause of ending the enslavement of Black people. Below the verse is a pastoral scene of what looks to be a white male shepherd and his dog tending to 2 ewes, a goat, and a ram beneath a tree. I have yet to discover the connection. However, many of Moore's early writing were pastoral plays written while she was a teacher and made suitable for young ladies to act. Therefore, this imagery may have been a scene from one of her plays. Whether Harris or her teacher selected this verse and imagery, we do not know. But I would say, like De Silva, Harris was likely being educated with a level of empathy for those still under enslavement and fighting for equal rights in the US. This sampler reveals her moral upbringing, her literary education, her needlework knowledge, and her creativity in the completion of such a beautifully balanced work. Literary scholars of children's literature and the history of childhood studies, Catherine Capshaw and Anna Mae Duane, have asserted we need to imagine children as active readers, agents who were fully capable of bringing critical and imaginative reading faculties to the text they engaged. Along with their own life experiences, it is also probable that De Silva and Harris were influenced and emboldened by the work of the famous young African-American poet, Phyllis Wheatley, who in 1773 had her book of poetry published in London. Her book included pieces on race, such as On Being Brought from Africa to America, which admonished Christians who view the sable race with scornful eyes to remember that Black people, as Black as Cain, may also be refined and go to heaven. We know that Adeline Harris stitched this beautiful sampler at the age of 14 as a student at the Clarkson School in Philadelphia. The Clarkson School was founded by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society's Board of Education in 1813 for the education of young, free Black children in the city of Philadelphia. An entrance book of the school revealed that Harris attended classes between November 1828 and June 1833, approximately 4.5 years under the tutelage of teacher Elizabeth Reynolds. At the time, she was living near 9th and Vine Streets, which was then on the edge of the city neighboring Spring Garden, another district, and known today as the Chinatown section of Philadelphia. By the 1850s, needlework was no longer a mandatory subject of the educational curriculum. However, it was still taught in many schools as a necessary skill to attain for future domestic and financial opportunities for young Black girls and women. Olivia Rebecca Parker, who worked her pictorial canvas work embroidery in 1852 when she was 14 years old and a student at the Lombard Street School, stitched in Berlin woolwork technique consisting of polychrome wool crewel yarns on a natural plain woven cotton canvas. The embroidery depicts a floral board creating an oval centerpiece with two white peasant children gathering wood with their dog companion near a water's edge. A finer yarn was used for the faces and hands of the two children. Above the image centered on the canvas, Parker stitched her signature line, Olivia Rebecca Parker, 1852. And below the image, also centered on the canvas, she stitched Lombard Street School. Parker utilized tent and cross stitches to complete her piece. The canvas work embroidery is in its original strainer and its original gilt frame. The embroidery measures 21.5 inches by 24.5 inches inside of its frame. Parker was born in the city of Philadelphia in 1838 to Adam and Olivia Parker. In 1852, at 14 years old, Parker completed her girlhood embroidery while a student at the Lombard Street School under the direction of two well-respected white teachers in the Black community, James M. Bird as principal and Maria C. Hutton as director of the girls' school. The school was established as a segregated public school for children of color in 1828 by the Philadelphia Board of Education under the leadership of Robert Box as president. Interestingly, 2 years later, in the August 12, 1854 issue of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, The girls' ornamental needlework and lace knitting were acknowledged as being unsurpassable by any other school at similar grades. The girls' recitation and copybooks were also commended for their neatness and quality. Moving beyond the creation of these embroideries by Mary De Silver, Adeline Harris, and Olivia Rebecca Parker, we have been able to trace their lives to various points in the 19th century. De Silver disappears from public records after she created her embroidery. Until the death of her mother, Judith Jones, in 1852, marked by a death certificate archived in the records of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas in Philadelphia. In 1852, De Silver would have been 67 years old. Then again, she disappears from the public record, and as of today, I have not found her profession nor her death record. Adeline Harris finished her schooling at Clarkson at 17 years old, became a domestic servant, and opened a savings account with the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, also known as PSFS. It was the first institution of its kind that also welcomed free Black people to open their own accounts. We know Harris remained in service until the age of 25 before she also disappears from the archives. Olivia Rebecca Parker, by the age of 22 on the 1860 census, we found her married to Joseph Brister, a prominent Black dentist in the city, and as the mother of two children, Olivia and James. Her husband is a socially active member of the Black Society, as evidenced in his membership in PSFS, the Banneker Institute, and the Social, Civil, and Statistical Association. The Brister family of four remained in the home of Olivia's parents, owned at 3 Cobb Street, along with Olivia's mother and 3 of Olivia's siblings, 1 sister and 2 brothers. Olivia's siblings were also working in the city, her sister as a seamstress, and her brothers as a barber and an apprentice shoemaker. Olivia is listed as keeping house. Fast forward to the 1880 census, their eldest daughter, Olivia, was a teacher, and son James was a dentist like his father. James became a student at the University of Pennsylvania School of Dentistry in 1871 and completed his studies in 1881, becoming a founding member of the Alumni Society. He was known as the first African American to graduate from the School of Dentistry. Today, the Alumni Society is named after him as the James Brister Society. In 1885, Olivia and her daughter, Olivia, appeared in the records of the Crucifixion Episcopal Church as members. 5 years later, in 1890, Olivia appears one last time in the church records for her death and burial at Olive Cemetery. Olivia Rebecca Parker passed away at the age of 56 years old. She was survived by her husband, Joseph Brister, and 4 children, Olivia, Dr. James, Theophilus, and Angela. The presence and voices of Black girls in the antebellum era of the U.S. have largely been ignored by some due to the seeming lack of sources in the archives. In the past 2 decades, however, scholars of Black women and Black girlhood, such as Sadia Hartman, Jessica Marie Johnson, Nazir Wright, Lakeisha Simmons, Ruth Nicole Brown, and the list goes on, thankfully, have all created or turned to various methods utilizing literary texts, reading against the grain and along the biased grain in the archives, the built environment and geography to find the presence of Black girls and women, their voices and experiences in history. I argue we can learn a great deal more about the burgeoning cultures of antebellum Black American communities, including their political and community organizing, as well as society as a whole, by censoring girls, such as Mary De Silva, Adeline Harris, and Olivia Rebecca Parker as historical subjects. And in doing so, we are blessed with the opportunity to examine the material culture of Black American girls, the creation of needlework in schools, homes, and places of employment were and are the testaments of the girls' educational accomplishments, reflections of their understanding and representations of respectability, domesticity, and their personal morals and values. In conclusion, in addition to the traditional archival sources, by incorporating material culture and visual cultural analysis of needlework, we are able to gain a more nuanced understanding of what Black girls were doing and how they were being reared for womanhood at home and in school during the development of a white supremacist society that was grappling with the place of free and newly freed Black American citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelli. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is Kate Sekules, and Kate will be speaking up on the subject, Evil in the Wardrobe, Stocking Darns and the Gilded Age Woman in New York, 1870 to 1900. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, and gosh, thank you, TSA. This is so well organized and such an amazing program. I'm really honored to be here. So this is part of ongoing research into surprisingly unexamined mending history. And so I'm here today to talk about stocking darns in the Gilded Age. And though the detail pertains to New York, many aspects of this research apply more generally, since no woman of this period escaped the relentless, tedious labor of darning stockings. As you know, to darn is to mend a hole in fabric by weaving with needle and thread, a definition no 19th century woman would need because mending had been an inescapable chore ever since clothes, and especially since stockings, since these were compulsory, flimsy, and abundant. For a woman in Gilded Age New York, stockings occupied a lot of time. Not only would yours need to keep up with fashion, they would need to be kept up in every sense. And falling short in your hosiery responsibilities would have grave repercussions. New York City, 1870 to 1900. This was a period of great change generally, but especially for women whose expectations and roles were completely transformed. And all the changes from industrialization to emancipation were mirrored in this deceptively simple chore of darning stockings. It was symbolic of so much to so many: women's work and what that should be, home, duty, virtue, and even love. Annie Ware Windsor Allen, happily darning here, is misleading because already by 1870, the general perception was that nobody darned anymore, or, quote, all women have left their proper sphere and the simple domestic virtues have vanished from the land, close quote. Instruction in American domestic virtue was newly available. Harriet Beecher Stowe is a very famous novelist, but also co-author with her sister Catherine of The American Woman's Home, the first explicitly domestic manual. In clothing, the Beecher sisters advocated reform, and in stockings, running thin places, the proverbial stitch in time, because everyone knew the first great principle of darning was never to darn a hole. Their equally renowned sister-in-law, Mrs. Henry Ward Beecher, wife of the famous preacher, was also a domestic advisor. She had a particular interest in, slight obsession with darning, which she considered the measure of a young woman's moral fiber. It is she who called undarned rents and stockings evil in the wardrobe. Nothing symbolized hearth and home better than the mending basket, with sentimental poems to celebrate it, such as this one from the Journal of Agriculture, 1868. Lucy, alone at the window, softly and cosily rocks, busily plying the needle, darning her husband's old socks. But such domestic bliss was rapidly slipping into the realm of nostalgia. So was the idea of the maiden skillfully stitching up her modest écru cotton stockings as an image of virtue with a touch of prurience, as illustrated by this 1820s ode to lovely Mira as she darns, quote, "Oft as thy needles pierce the yielding hose, so oft thy beauties pierce my yielding breast. On me be exercised thy mending art. Come, darn the hole that rankles in my heart." The so-called girl of the period, usually summarized as French learning piano playing, was still doomed to darn, but she was no Lucy or Mira. She hadn't been taught at Mama's knee. She needed written instruction, and she balked at the hearthside basket overflowing with stockings. She aimed to earn her own living and vote, a complex, alarming process of change the press dubbed the woman question. The question of whether woman was a good darner was fraught. She was often judged on it in print since, as one Kate Frothingham wrote in The Olive Branch, "Persons' characters can be discovered by the way they mend their stockings. She who neglects to strengthen the thin places is well-meaning and conscientious, but inconsiderate, while she who puckers a darn together is hot-tempered with an undisciplined mind." One particular kind of darn was unmentionable, but top of the stocking mends, shown there, belonged to a central issue of stocking upkeep, keeping them up. This was hard. They had no cling, and because stocking support required effort, poor work in the form of wrinkles were as shameful as darns. Quote, "When a woman sees one of her sisters with wrinkled stockings," wrote a New York newspaper woman in 1893, "down goes the barometer of her opinion. If the offender has a husband, the other woman knows he doesn't care for her, and she doesn't blame him." But there were worse problems than what one woman called the depraved and treacherous complicated toggery of stocking suspenders. Some 35% of female New Yorkers were so-called sewing women, slaving with the needle for middlemen called sweaters in slum tenements, barely surviving. Their sole pair of much darned stockings used old-fashioned elastic garters, which caused, as Madame de Moray reported in her monthly magazine, quote, "vertigo, rush of blood to the head, congestion, loss of circulation, cold feet, deformity," close quote, and even death. During this period, a growing epidemic of the basic below-knee garter-induced varicose ulcers crowded workhouse infirmaries. In 1870, an editor at the American Agriculturalist connected this local poverty with lost darning skills and county fair sewing prizes and conceived of a grand mending competition. Quote, "9/10 of the wives of our country will have far greater need of knowing how to patch well than how to make good patchwork. The benevolent ladies of our city," close quote, "would judge the entries, then after the exhibition distribute them to the destitute." The subsequent display of winners in their Broadway offices, this is a display here from the magazine, caused quite a sensation. The announcement here shows the didactic intent. Even little toddlekins building castles in the air with walls made of hope by darning. The well-meaning scheme backfired. 1,300 odd expertly mended precious garments flooded in with heartbreaking letters. Quote, "This is stout clothing, almost past mending now, but the truth is we are all so poor out here." Or, "And I sent the only pair of stockings we can spare with the darns of 2 years in them." Close quote. Turned out it wasn't farmers' wives who couldn't fix stockings, it was New Yorkers. This shortfall in darning skills led to absurdly pointed morality tales in the press. In "He Married the Girl Who Could Darn," stocking tweeter accidentally exposed and the good darner is chosen as wife. Darning Stockings concludes, quote, "As for Edward, the slattern's stocking cured his love. He married your cousin Mary. She had the cleanest of stockings with the daintiest of little darns. He could resist no longer," close quote. But the girl of the period was resistant to hectoring. In a piece on the agriculturalist's exhibition, Maud sees a darned stocking and cries, "What an awful waste of time. I should think it was a sin. I couldn't do such work as that, and I'd be ashamed to if I could." Then it turns out that Darn had won her own mother first prize in the competition. But even if Maud did darn, her stocking wardrobe was now too big to cope. Striped stockings were partly inspired by New York stage stars, and a lady wearing them was controversial. Quote, "The gaudier the stripes, the more she should be shunned. She is a lion seeking whom she may devour. She is the ice cream girl, the soda water girl, the fried oyster girl. She is the girl who wants you to take her to the theatre." For more stocking inspiration, presumably. The new stripes were found in dry goods stores that mushroomed along Ladies' Mile, 6th Avenue above Union Square. This was modern shopping with busy hosiery departments in the front sections with accessories, gloves and parasols, pretty much where they remain today. Because stockings were not viewed as undergarments but were discussed always in terms of feet. If legs had to be mentioned, they were known unfailingly as limbs. It wasn't just stripes. Every dress needed a matching foot, and fashionable stocking wardrobes ran to dozens or hundreds. Black was a perennial, and white was alternately despised and adored, and also used as an underlayer to protect against blood poisoning from bad dyes. By 1880, 90% of stockings sold in New York were coloured. The Sun reported that the revelation of colourful stockings no longer shocks the experienced spectator, however modest, but this wasn't always true. Hosiery was selected in semi-public, and colour matching was important, sniffed one reporter. "The brazen, up-to-date female puts her foot on the seat to get the desired shade and lose the respect of every critic in sight." Then he notes, "The finest lisle thread goods have been sold this season for 30 cents. Indeed, technological advances, factory expansion, and trade deals were continuously dropping prices and expanding styles. The mid-70s to mid-80s featured silk-embroidered insteps and clock designs with, reported Goaded Lady's book, all the ornamentation upon the front and arranged lengthwise upon the foot, extending above the ankle. New fast black dyes and semi-automatic knitters brought yet more fanciful designs, and Godey's warned, "Purchasers cannot show too much care in selecting, as some of the newest stockings are both conspicuous and vulgar." There were trempe boots, lace insets, changeable silks, goldwork and spangles, jeweled embroideries, contrasting fronts and backs or tops and feet. Skirts were still heavy and trained, but women selected stockings, as one reporter put it, "in case a saucy wind blows a dress a little to one side and a man's eye catches a glimpse of the snowy goods with all their fancy embroideries, and his heart goes pit-a-pat." There were reports of men loitering on street corners to ogle erogenous ankles, but still they judged. Quote, "A woman who would wear red stockings from choice is as much to be dreaded as the girl with red hair." Or, "A white-stockinged woman has no poetry in her soul. I always feel sorry for a woman who wants that kind of hosiery." At least they didn't pity her nor judge her on her darning now. So fast was the stocking fashion turnover that a style was out before it got worn out. Replacing had replaced darning, and sales of darning needles had dropped 95%. For the remaining domestic drudgery, as it was called, dozens of darning machines were patented to join the sewing machine in every parlour. Unfortunately, they didn't really work. But in the late 80s, just as stocking numbers were up and darning was down, attitudes to the despised task started to alter. Thanks partly to the photographer Jacob Riis and the reformer Helen Campbell, the plight of the 200,000 sewing women was becoming a cause célèbre. The Sun dubbed them Gotham's white slaves. The benevolent ladies of New York took action. One such was the formation of a now forgotten type of business, the Mending Bureau, providing work for sewing women and benevolent ladies alike. Harper's Bazaar ran articles called "Housekeeping Made Easy," with darning diagrams and poems. "Mend, sisters, mend with care. Mend where you see the signs of wear. Mend in the presence of the great big tear." Darning was almost respected. Especially worth mending was the expensive new stocking craze, inspired equally by dress reform and chorus girls. There were button-on, thigh-high pantellas and tights, which, though wicked because just exactly like those worn by actresses on the stage, were adopted by society belles as a combination stocking. Costliest was the Bernhardt extension, silky, evoluted tights that begin at the toes and are gartered about the neck. And although this bifurcated underclothing, these forked stockings, were seen as scandalous, they were quickly adopted by the best people. If you couldn't run to $20 silk union suits or wouldn't waste your Gouport lace inserts on New York slushy streets, no problem. You could buy unsold stock and closeouts. High-grade hosiery, fine lisle and Richelieu, ribbed and fast black cashmere and 40-gauge balbrigans could now be had for as little as 10 cents the pair. These were deemed not worth darning, but anyway, who had the time? As skirts obligingly cleared the ankle, women were bicycling and golfing, and stockings evolved accordingly. There was the scoop-in with a contrasting boot, and the graziella with black feet and coloured tops. There were plaids, zigzags, stripes and lozenges, and fruits and leaves. The practical half-hose was popular. The San Francisco Argonaut declared, all eccentric stockings are an execrable taste, but New Yorkers disagreed. As a hosiery dealer told The Sun in 1895, it is remarkable how few plain stockings are called for. Perversely, now that the many, many stockings were too durable or too out of fashion to need it or too cheap to deserve it, darning entered a renaissance. Magazines were full of instructions, still saying, the woman who wears undarned stockings is the popular idea of a sloven, but then absolving readers from darning anything under $5. The New York Association of Sewing Schools formed with 91 institutions, including 2 for the blind, and Brooklyn's Pratt Institute pioneered the teaching of mending on normal school teacher training curricula. Maybe darning had just skipped a generation. The French-speaking piano-playing girls were now adopting it with gusto. They started mending clubs, students darned stockings for pin money, and thimble parties were all the rage, including darning competitions where girls judged bachelor's socks. This spawned a strain of world-turned upside-down humour with an edge of hysteria. But the impulse behind the agriculturalists' 1870 competition still pertained in a city with a population explosion and appalling slums. By 1900, New York had earned the nickname Homeless City. Now benevolent ladies and their daughters and newly trained teachers are united to raise the status of plain sewing with new books and improving songs called Mend the Tears and The Idle Girl's Serenade. In 1888, mending was on the curriculum of just 9 Manhattan elementary schools. 10 years later, it was taught in every public school at every level in all 5 boroughs. Darning was now a profession and a recreation and a pedagogical discipline. And yet, stockings could still be had for a dime a pair. Starvation wages, said the Tribune, fill the counters with the cheapest of cheap goods. I can't help noticing a parallel with our own consumption habits. As Helen Campbell said in 1895 about free trade impact on sewing women, America already has free trade in woman's misery. Tragically, America and the first world consumers still has. Today's sewing women just aren't in New York tenements, but conveniently out of sight in Vietnam and Bangladesh and Myanmar. Why should we care about mending? Because the invisibility of mending in history is related to the invisibility of women in history, and therefore the invisibility of women in sweatshops right now. If we don't learn from mending, we might just continue to outsource the misery of our own sewing women. Don't be evil in the wardrobe, darn it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Another wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is I-Fen Huang, and I-Fen will be presenting the paper titled One Man's Search for Modernity, the Untold Story of Wu Meiling and Embroidery Education in Early 20th Century Taiwan. Welcome.
I'm presenting an unusual case study from colonial Taiwan, which is about a male painter's involvement with embroidery education at the girls' school. And this hidden story bespeaks the complex history of East Asia in early 20th century. And I hope This presentation would contribute to discussion on issues concerning gender roles and modernization and tradition. So the focus of our presentation today is Meiling. He was born in 1897, just right at the beginning of the colonial period of Taiwan under Japanese rule. And he enjoyed an incredibly long life and career as a painter and a fine art teacher. Here on the screen, you see paintings that he did when in his 80s, 90s, and even a photo of him painting when he was 106 back in 2001. And here is him working, and also one of his most famous works from his early years, which is done in Japanese style. Since when he started learning to paint, it was the Japanese painting that was the dominant mainstream. But my presentation today is not about the painter Meiling, but about a rarely noticed aspect of this incredible painter. In 1926, Meiling came to Puzi Girls' School, where he continued to teach until 1941. He served as a fine art teacher there for the entire school from first grade to eighth grade. And during that period, he created lots of paintings since he was a very enthusiastic painter. Like this one is a local landscape called Autumn at the Land Pond, which he did in 1930. Also, as a fine art teacher, he put his skill to use at other occasions. For example, when there is a theatrical or dancing performance at the girls' school, then he would design the stage or do the stage background decoration. In this photo is a performance in late 1920s. But the most unusual part about his career at the school is that he not only served as fine art teacher, as you see here, that he took the students, the female students out to do sketch from life outdoors, but also he had an unusual cooperation with the embroidery teacher at the school. Here in this photo, you see on the first row is our painter Meiling to your right, and the embroidery teacher Huang to your left. The two of them started cooperating on the embroidery curriculum early since Meiling started teaching at the school. So in mid-1920s, the two of them have teamed up to work on the embroidery lessons for the entire girls' school students. And certainly Huang is the one who taught the girls how to embroider all the stitches and techniques. But Meiling here served a very unusual role. He not only offered design for the students' works, and also we will see later in the slides that he also participate in the entire process, so to speak, that he would discuss with the students and offers suggestions and comments to their works. And also, he would encourage students to decide how to put the colors together, what color palette to use. And in this case, he would also put his painting skills to students' work. For example, this one is an embroidery by the girl student named Cai Nian. And the design is by Meiling, the teacher. And after the girl student finished embroidering the work, Meiling would use paint and brush to add colors, to add finishing touches onto the embroidery. So as a final touch and also to complement the entire piece of work. Now, the question comes to mind that why would Meiling work with an embroidery teacher? And why was embroidery taught at a girls' school during this period to begin with? Where did all this come from? And the answer is Japan. In the late half of the 19th century, under the economic and political pressure from the Western powers, Japan was forced to open ports for foreign trade after its long state isolation and initiated a series of reform. The Meiji period saw fundamental change in various aspects of the Japanese society and culture, including all sorts of traditional crafts. Officials were sent abroad for fact-finding trips so as to catch up with the West and modernize Japan. Soft industries like textiles filled Japan with much-needed foreign capital for speedy modernization. As the Europeans and Americans developed increased interest in exotic goods of Japan, Meiji merchants decided to transform their age-old tradition. Aiming at Western consumers, merchants and craftsmen of traditional Japanese handicrafts changed the formats, subjects, and styles to better meet the needs and preferences of these new clients. Embroidered and woven textiles made in new fashion were sent to various world fairs and expositions and met with critical acclaim, which further stimulated the pursuit of Japanese fine art textiles. Meiji embroideries soon became luxury goods keenly sought after in Europe and America, adorning the interiors and dresses alike. And together with this transformation in the production of luxurious fine textiles, there was another transformation going on. New modes of transmitting the skills of making embroideries were introduced to people outside of the craftsman circle as part of the modernization effort. In other words, in the process of the modernization of Japanese embroidery, embroidery was institutionalized. And this reflects in three aspects in embroidery education, largely for female students. The first is social education. There is a popularization of embroidery education institutes that mostly admitted female students. And the second is professional education. Vocational embroidery schools were established during this period. And the third is general education, which concerns our presentation today the most. Embroidery was introduced to elementary and middle schools and included in the curriculum as a critical way of nurturing, quote, good wives and wise mothers, unquote. This approach exerted the most widely spread and profound influence on the transformation of nature of embroidery in modern society. In Japanese embroidery factories and workshops, male embroiderers abound, and many of the leading modernizers of embroidery were male themselves. Yet now, with these new approaches, the emphasis on moral cultivation inherited the traditional value of female virtue and reinforced the connection between embroidery and femininity. Women's education was aimed at including women into the national production forces. And similarly, Textile in China underwent a series of change in an eye to modernize the industry and save the nation. The most famous modernizer of Chinese embroidery is Shen Shou and Hua Qi. Shen Shou learned embroidery at a very young age and became noticed when her works were presented to the Empress Dowager Cixi at her 70th birthday. With the Qing government support, between November 1905 and February 1906, Shen Shou were sent to Japan together with her husband to learn about the modern artistic embroidery practice in Japan. That time was in the last decade of the Qing dynasty, when a series of political, economical, military, cultural, and educational reforms, many learned from Japan, that were implemented to sustain the Qing court in power after its defeat by the Western powers in the Boxer Uprising. And after Shen Shou and her husband returned from Japan in May 1906, with Empress Dowager Cixi's support, Shen Shou was invited to Beijing to take up the post of chief instructor of the section of embroidery workers under the Ministry of Agriculture, Industry, and Commerce. And later on, she also established self-supporting institute for the transmission of womanly work. And later on, her effort was continued with the support of the official entrepreneur Zhang Jian, who invited her to teach at the Nantong Women's Normal College that you now see on the screen, where Shen Shou took on the post of director of the Nantong Bureau of Textile and Embroidery, and also director of the Nantong Institute for the Transmission of Womanly Work. Arguably, this institute is the most successful embroidery training school for women that was set up in early Republican China. Together with the help of her early disciple Jin Jingfen, during the 8 years there, Shen Shou trained a generation of embroiderers from Nantong and beyond that profoundly influenced the development of modern Chinese embroidery. Another important reformer of Chinese embroidery is Hua Qi. She is niece of a mathematician and translator of Western science and technology. In 1906, Hua Qi taught embroidery in a girls' school in Wuxi, and later in 1912, her husband and she opened in Shanghai an embroidery education school, which ran for about 10 years. And later, she also taught at a girls' school that was established by a wife of the Jewish businessman. Her work, Rooster, that you see on the screen, is now in the Palace Museum in Beijing. This work captured award in the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. And later on, she published a textbook called The Art of Embroidery. There are several common features in these modernizers of Chinese embroidery. For instance, both Shen Shou and Hua Qi employed Western or Western style paintings as the underdrawings for their works. For example, Shen Shou's embroidered portrait of Queen Elena was based on a photo of her. And her most famous work, the portrait of Jesus, is based on a postcard that is a reproduction of that painting. And both Shen Shou and Hua Qi also used needles and color threads to try to emulate and achieve the Western visual effect. And They also changed the subjects. They no longer use Chinese landscape, the landscape painting, which is shanshui, but now they took subjects of Western landscape, and other subjects like animals and portraits were also adopted and became popular during this time. So this wave of incorporating embroidery into school curriculum was soon spread to the entire Northeast Asia. Taiwan was no exception. Reports related to school embroideries of that period can easily be found in newspapers. And that's also why in 1926, after Wu Meiling joined the Girl School, he would team up with Huang for the embroidery curriculum. And when embroidery became institutionalized, there also saw painters involving in production of embroideries by helping with the under drawings. Embroidered paintings and pictorial textiles have been developed in China and Japan alike for centuries, and there certainly have been paintings used as curtain for textiles. However, the situation in the 19th century is very different. There evolved new modes of cooperation between painters and textile workshops around the turn of the 20th century, which bear more sophisticated levels and meanings. As we pointed out earlier, in China, Shenshou and Huaqi employed Western or Western-style paintings as the underdrawings for their works. And they used needles and color threads to emulate the visual effects of Western paintings and photography. In the case of Shenshou, inspired by Western oil painting and modern photography and Japanese embroidery that she encountered in Japan, she developed a new style called Fangzhenxiu, literally embroidery imitating the real. And this work, portrait of the Jesus, when she sent this work to the Panama Pacific Exposition, she also had a booklet on it. And there, she particularly emphasized that in this work, there is no color added by retouching after the work was completed. And she reacted strongly to the degraded embroidery from traditional China. And she criticized and rejected the Chinese brush and ink in favor of the Western shading and coloring by using 111 different colors and silk threads as the booklet, the explanation note you see now on the screen says. And this is a very fundamental change in embroiderers' position regarding the relationship between embroidery and painting, which leads to a drastically different path and subsequent technical innovations in the modernization of Chinese painting. However, in the colonial island Taiwan, Wu Meiling took a very different position. He went against the trend. With his training in traditional Chinese painting, Wu Meiling applied ink and color onto his students' embroideries for finishing touches or enhancing the work. Here, painting and embroidery complement each other and resulting in new effects that were not found in works done by just either of these two mediums. However, a look into history reveals that Wu Meiling's endeavor echoed with traditional Chinese embroiderers' invention hundreds of years ago, when the most innovative embroiderer back then strove to integrate the techniques of painting and embroidery for unprecedented effects. Here on the screen is a well-known work by a 17th century female embroiderer, Han Ximeng, who applied ink and brush to her embroidered pictures using techniques such as ink wash, as seen in the swirling clouds and water in the example on the screen. Therefore, this female embroiderers work truly integrated embroidery with painting mediums and techniques. And that's also exactly what Meiling pursued. In conclusion, Taiwan at the turn of the 20th century, under the Japanese rule, although followed the Japanese system, embroidery education was made as an indispensable part of the school curriculum, but Meiling managed to take a different route and took a different position as how embroidery can be conceived and pursued. To most of the renovation-minded Chinese and Japanese embroiderers at the turn of the 20th century, embroidery should reign supreme, and despite its close relationship with painting. They tried hard to accomplish with embroidery every visual effect that was achieved with painting. However, for Meiling, embroidery and painting can go hand in hand. And that is a very different position from his contemporary, but a revival of earlier tradition, a position that was also taken by the Gu family embroiderer centuries ago. So this case study thus uncovers a rare story of one male painter's contribution to embroidery education in a colonial island, who wove cultures from both sides, blended innovation with tradition, all on his own terms. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Darden Bradshaw, and Darden will be presenting the paper titled Culturally Responsive Art Education for Girls, Moving the Margins in Malawi. Welcome, Darden.
Across the globe, people are working to change patriarchal systems that continue to perpetuate systemic oppression of women. Nowhere is this need more prevalent than in Malawi, Africa. When considering hidden stories and hidden lives, I think of the realities for young women in Malawi today. Certainly much has improved, but there is much work yet to be done, as Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world, sits at the bottom of the Human Development Index. It is 174 out of 187 countries on that index. And it's valuable to note that the countries below it are all at war. Throughout this presentation, I will intersperse my personal visual journaling images and reflections with a narrative that situates an experience when I traveled to Malawi during summer 2019 with a colleague to deliver a culturally responsive art education within a girls' empowerment program in the rural northern region of Chilumba. When Novia McIntosh invited me to work with her on this program for young women, I was filled with hope, fear, and anticipation. I had no real conception of what I would learn, or the ways in which I would be challenged, and the threads that would tether me to a small rural village on the banks of Lake Malawi, 8,177 miles from Dayton, Ohio. When the first primary school in Malawi was founded in 1875 and guidelines to develop education became available in an independent Malawi in 1964, girls were excluded from education, with boys being the only pupils considered. The impact of this decision continues to reverberate today. Such a historical gender bias within education constructed in Malawian schooling a premise for the perpetuation and inaccessibility of education of girls into contemporary society. Post-colonialism meant visibility of Black men and boys, while subsequent independence from British rule meant intellectual engagement and freedom for men and boys. But what about women? Students in rural areas and girls have less access to education than do their male and urban counterparts. In the area in which this study was conducted, there's a 94% enrollment rate of all students at the primary level. These enrollment figures fall to 17% for secondary school. Out of the 17% who enroll in high school, only 5% of females complete their education. This equates to 0.0085% of females graduating in the area. Access to education is fraught with barriers at all levels. Primary education is not subsidized by the government. A student's family pays for a child to attend primary school, And in large families, this means, excuse me, that girls' access to primary school takes a back seat to that of her brothers. As a largely rural country, high school education occurs in boarding schools where learners are removed from their family support. When students graduate from high school, they take a countrywide government-administered admissions exam. For those making top marks, the lottery system determines access to university and technical school. Therefore, for a female to get to college, she has to overcome extraordinary odds. The question of how can young girls advance when historical gender bias within Malawian schooling not only provides a premise for the perpetuation and inaccessibility of women's access, it's compounded because Malawian girls face cultural and practical barriers too. 2/3 of the population in Malawi are under the age of 25. 40% of female teenagers have already begun childbearing or are sexually active by 12. Unreported instances of polygamy, rape, and incest add to these figures. 2 out of 5 girls in Karonga, the catchment area in northern Malawi where this work took place, report early marriage as the reason for dropping out of secondary school. Education is a space where young women's lives and stories are hidden from view, as they are marginalized and minoritized by men in this former colonial society. Some conditions that impact educational access include being forced into early marriage, the inability to attend school when menstruating due to lack of sanitary supplies, or the need to sell one's body to gain access to daily needs. These factors, compounded with the generational and cultural curse of teenage pregnancy, prohibit pregnant girls from attending school and are further exacerbated by sexual disease such as AIDS and limited access to health care. As we were confronted with the systemic stigmatization and the social inferiorization perpetuating the subordination of women, my colleague and I wondered, how could we empower minoritized and vulnerable girls entrapped in this cycle in a very short period of time? Could a culturally responsive art engagement disrupt the dehumanization of girls, many of whom see education as out of reach, or they see it as leftovers that are given to them after the boys and men have gone to school? Determined to Develop is a non-governmental organization located in northern Malawi with whom we worked. They actively seek to support the sustainable development of resources while working to counteract oppression. In response to high school dropout rates for women, D2D developed a non-formal curriculum aimed at promoting girls' education. The program, administered weekly in girls' club sessions, provides an all-female safe space for life skill development on topics such as self-esteem, leadership, goal setting, study techniques, and healthy relationships. To contextualize my governing gaze, I'm a white, queer, female art educator and fiber artist. I taught for 7 years in inner city middle schools as an art integration specialist before I moved to higher education 7 years ago, where I teach at a primarily white institution, preparing pre-service art educators. More importantly, perhaps to this study, I am the mother of an adopted Black daughter who rarely saw herself reflected in education. Now grown, my daughter is raising a precious Black boy in an increasingly hostile and violent United States. As a social justice art educator, I daily work to challenge the normative practices of education so that he may potentially be educated differently than his mother was. Arriving in Chilumba after 36 hours of travel, I felt disconnected, but open to what was to come. My sense of discomfort would stay with me for the duration of my experience. Beyond a lack of familiarity with the place, the food, cultural customs, and the landscape, I was not used to feeling such vulnerability as a female. As a white person in a post-colonial country, I visibly represented oppression and wealth, yet my femaleness made me invisible except as an object. 2 months before, when invited to join Novia in this work, I could not imagine what the experience would hold. Having grown up overseas, I had never set foot on the African continent, but I was not a stranger to travel or cultural difference. As Novia and I worked in the months leading up to our departure, I researched where I would be, and my interest in working with the girls group grew. I was keenly aware that while I was entering a culture and place with which I may be unfamiliar, I had experienced gender oppression. I identified with and felt called to support women, marginalized by virtue of their birth. I got a departmental grant and I purchased fabric paint, blank unlined journals, watercolor crayons, pencils, erasers, and paintbrushes, and plastic zipper envelopes. I envisioned each participant getting her own art kit. As we met with Abby, the head teacher at the boys' school, Kelsey, the program officer for D2D, and Chim Wei, who runs the Girls Initiative at D2D, to discuss the arts engagements we were going to do, I shared the art kit that I had brought and the goals of the visual journaling and the collaborative art making. Both Abby and Kelsey were intrigued, and given their years of experience living and working in the area, they were cautious. They informed me most girls lived in a one-room house with an entire family. My ignorance and assumption were embarrassing. I wanted art to serve as a vehicle for empowerment, yet I realized I had no lived experience for how art was employed within Malawian culture, nor did I have much experience with Malawian culture. In fact, I would learn that art and visual culture are not seen within Malawi as valued for study in school, as has been the case somewhat in the US. Art is a part of daily life in sewing and in wood carving and in painting sold for tourism. But for most rural Malawians, art is necessarily utilitarian, not an aesthetic expression or seen as a form of empowerment. My wish for each girl to have her own art kit further demonstrated my ignorance and privilege. I had assumed each young woman would have her own private space, perhaps a room or a corner in a shared space, but a location where she could keep and use these items, bringing them with her to the girls' empowerment meetings in the same fashion that many Western children carry books and supplies to school. My plan clearly needed to evolve, to be responsive. So I shared my wish to create collaborative fabric work where each girl participated. I needed local material. Abby suggested a trip to the local market to purchase chitenje fabric. Chitenje are colorful, relatively inexpensive, accessible, and commercially printed wax-resist pattern cloth prevalent in Malawi. They're worn by these women in these images. Women use them as aprons tied around their waist or at their chest to keep clothes underneath clean and undamaged as they work in the field, washing dishes in the river, cooking at the fire, or riding on the crowded transport. They're also used as cross-body wraps to carry children, as head wraps to cushion large baskets or buckets atop heads, and as blankets on which to sit. The symbolism of using a cloth based in colonialism and commercialization will become clear. Changes continue to be necessary, and we're a reminder that collaboration and culturally responsive teaching and art making necessitates flexibility, openness, and a willingness to acknowledge motivation as inseparable from culture. Having been educated in the US, where the personal is given privilege over the communal, I struggled to let go of my vision. I could see how each girl having her own kit would not work. Somehow I was convinced, though, that each woman should have her own visual journal. The numbers increased from 29 to nearly 50 participants. I was pleased. I did not want anyone to be excluded. I expressed my commitment that each girl at least have their own visual journal. So the D2D staff found unused lined blank books that they had in surplus. This was a workable compromise, yet I continued to feel frustrated. These young women had so little that belongs wholly to them. I wanted and in some ways needed them to have the gift of the art kit. I saw it as an expression of an external expression of their value, but I was projecting my values and beliefs onto them. Saturday morning began with another beautiful sunrise across Lake Malawi. Long before 8 a.m., groups of young girls gathered around the campus, dressed in their church clothes and smiles. We planned our interactions with the girls around the theoretical framework of culturally responsive pedagogy, a pedagogy of opposition, not unlike critical pedagogy, but specifically committed to collective, not merely individual empowerment. We saw this experience as both reciprocal engagement and transmission of knowledge. As educators, we learn to teach across modalities, recognizing that one student may respond to words, another to performance, and still another to listening and creating. As we had planned the day's events, we made conscious decisions to include various forms of artistic expression and meaning making, because it was critical to share the space with the cultural customs that resonated with these young women. So therefore we used poetry, spoken word, and a native narrative to foster cultural engagement. The morning began for all of us as learners. Novia and I watched as Chimwemwe, Kelsey, and Lauren led us through the creation of reusable sanitary pads. Material had been cut in advance. Each girl had 2 pieces of fabric, a blanket square, and a piece of clean grocery bag to make her reusable sanitary pad. I had brought sewing needles, hard to come by in Malawi, from the United States. Thread and buttons had been purchased at the market in Karanga. Over the next 2 hours, each girl hand-sewed a cloth that would protect her underwear. As they worked, the conversation centered around how to clean and reuse the pads. Knowing how to make their own sanitary pads, these young women would not need to skip school when menstruating, nor would they need to exchange sex for pocket change in order to purchase commercially produced sanitary protection. I sewed alongside the girls, struggling to communicate across the language barrier, but I felt a camaraderie and grounding. At that moment, I was not other. We worked together, thread and needle, stitching in the universal language of hope, industriousness, women's work, and communion. The girls chatted, laughed, and sang, thoroughly enjoying each other and our time together. Elliot Eisner notes that art education serves as a site of empowerment, particularly when it is tied to cultural practices that are derived from community. Even though our oral language varied, the language of sewing and stitching fostered building new community together. A goal of culturally responsive teaching is to provide opportunity and support students to learn meaningful academic knowledge, skills, and dispositions while affirming their identity and heritage, so that therefore we all become critically aware and prepared to challenge inequalities. We concluded making sanitary pads and moved into a series of engagements that both affirmed and offered spaces to challenge norms. Novia and one of our students, Morgan, began singing, and as they shared, the voices of many young women joined in harmony. After the music, Memory, a female student from the University of Livingstonia, shared and spoke about her experiences growing up and confronting challenges as a young woman in Malawi. I felt my throat tighten based on what she had overcome. I scanned the room, mentally acknowledging the gulf that existed across race, language, culture, and privilege. But I saw that while we were worlds apart, the indomitable spirit of these young women reinforced that it is in my privileged position I have the power to evoke change. Novia performed Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman. As she boldly expressed the poet's powerful words, the girls' faces followed her around the room. If Memory represented overcoming patriarchy and oppression in Malawi, Novia embodied a future they had rarely seen reflected around them, as educators in Malawi are overwhelmingly male. Here was this gorgeous, powerful, articulate Black college professor whose presence alone epitomized the power of phenomenal woman. I invited the girls to join me in working with fiber and creating a quilt-like construction. Printing was chaotic and fun. One by one, each girl's hand was painted the color they had selected, pressed down on the sheet, making clear and recognizable imprints. A glorious, colorful riot of handprints moved up and down the fabric as they explored how to leave their mark. And using fabric markers, they wrote their names beside their handprints. Visual journaling, a deeply embedded part of my personal artistic and pedagogical practice, extends the reflective, systemic process of journaling in a written narrative to include drawing, collage, and painting. It gains credence and support within the field of art education for its value as a reflective practice supporting self-awareness and, meaning making. So here I shared my visual journal with the students and briefly discussed the purpose and invited them to participate. As Memory had expressed in her talk, we become who we are not by virtue of the negative or challenging experiences in our lives, but by the choices and intentions we set and commit to follow daily. So I invited these young women to envision a life beyond their immediate present using a journaling prompt called I Will Be. As they wrote what they would be and what they envisioned for themselves, we prompted them with questions that might foster thinking. If you were to travel to another city, how might you get there? What is it you've always desired that you see your male peers getting or doing? These young women noted their dreams: to be a driver, exceedingly rare for women in rural Malawi; to be a teacher, not normative; and they dreamed in personal ways, like being independent, strong, faithful, courageous, and in ways that challenged their culture, as a nurse, a judge, a university professor, or a bank manager. Working with watercolor crayons, gliding smoothly across the paper, they began to transform their drawings into paintings. The visual play and pleasure was present. As our art making drew to a close, the girls shared their journal pages, claiming what they would be through verbal and public affirmation. Holding each other's dreams up, they became an opportunity to learn about one another, to find ways to celebrate each other's hopes, and create a deep psychic space as girl after girl stood proclaiming an envisioned future in a safe, supported, all-female space. We concluded our time together, and the girls burst into song and serenaded us. It was a beautiful moment of reciprocity and of sharing one's art. That evening, despite being physically tired, I was buoyed by the strength of these young women who withstood challenges under which many would buckle. I'm going to skip that. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'll come back to that if we have time. The girls left their journals behind with the chitenge fabric so that she had selected so that they could be covered. And on Saturdays, when they returned to girls group, their journal would be there for them, through which they could continue to mark the present and articulate the future. Days later, as I packed to return home, I bundled their fabric squares carefully among my things. Much more than pieces of cloth, they reflected each girl's dreams and hopes. I had been entrusted to temporarily guard and honor them. I processed the impact of my Malawian experiences while piecing the chitenge fabric together into a construction. And as I did so, I was continually taken back to Chilumba, Malawi, and to Africa. My anger at the misogynistic treatment of young Black women was channeled, and I used the medium of women's work in cloth to stitch resistance to systemic oppression. This completed collaborative quilt was raffled off on October 29 at the Social Practice of Human Rights Conference, raising a mere $1,500. While not a lot to us, that amount is a fortune for the Girls Empowerment Group in Malawi and will support income-generating opportunities. The collaborative work continues. In 2020, I worked with Chimwemwe via email and Skype to revise the outdated non-formal curriculum for the girls program. And while I was to leave in 2 months, in December, to work with D2D, developing an assessment tool and providing arts integration training due to COVID, I will not be doing that, but I will be using the girls' portraits as the foundation for a work scheduled for exhibition in 2021. Thank you.
Our final speaker for this session is Amanda Thompson, who will be presenting the paper Altering Clothing, Appropriation, Assimilation, and Native Resilience in Florida, Seminole, and White Settler Relations, 1940s to 1950s.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be part of this virtual panel. I'm just absolutely humbled by all the research that my fellow panelists have presented. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples, now known as Providence, Rhode Island, and that my residence here perpetuates the structure of settler colonialism I'm speaking about today. This paper is my first attempt to make sense of one thread of archival research in support of my dissertation, tentatively titled Seminole Miccosukee Patchwork, Craft, Sovereignty, and Settler Colonial Relations. And I must apologize for my photos. Their quality reflects my talents rather than the objects and clothing themselves. A 1940s postcard advertises Southern Florida's tropical Hobbyland Indian village with an image of Seminole women and children featured at the attraction. While they gather around a totem pole influenced by Northwest Coast Native cultures, their fashion is distinctly Seminole, typical of its shapes and styles of the 1940s. The women wear full skirts spliced with many horizontal stripes of contrasting fabric and patchwork strips, and overlaid with rickrack and bias tape, paired with capes of crepe and an abundance of beaded necklaces, with their hair wrapped around a board to create a sweeping visor. The girls wear dresses with full skirts of vivid pattern fabrics, similarly striped with contrasting horizontal bands. These outfits would have been made by Seminole seamstresses using purchased materials on manual sewing machines under chickees, the open-sided palm-thatched structure in the background of this postcard. While it would be valuable to contextualize these styles within the history of Seminole fashion from the 19th century to the present, instead today, I am speaking about the work of the woman who collected this postcard and her peers. Irma Abbey preserved this postcard not to advertise tropical hobbyland, but her own work in getting Marie Willie, the young girl on the lower right here, into public school. Abbey features Willie prominently in a 1960s scrapbook. In one spread, a 7-year-old Willie, dressed similarly to in the postcard, tries on shoes in a Fort Lauderdale store, near the Seminole Dania Reservation where Willie likely lived. Willie needed shoes, as the Broward County Public Schools required she wear them. Dania Reservation abuts Fort Lauderdale, and both are within the limits of Broward County. According to a Fort Lauderdale Historical Society profile, in 1946, Abbey, quote, spent hours, days, and weeks in the office of the Broward County Superintendent of Education, begging, pleading, arguing, and demanding that these children be given an education. He relented, provided the children were properly clothed, by which he meant with panties and shoes, and properly trained in sanitary habits, end quote. This photo documents Willie's preparations to move from a Seminole education system taught in the Miccosukee language by her clan elders as to the values and life ways of the Seminole people, to the education of the settler state, which required that she not only dress in clothing of the settler society, but also speak English, spend all days indoors, and behave according to settler expectations. The opposite page of the scrapbook features photos from Willie's church wedding 13 years later. The scrapbook reveals that Abbey is proud of her role in Willie's life, taking credit for her education through 11th grade, and her transformation from a shoeless girl dressed in the clothing of the Seminole to a settler ideal of femininity, a bride in a voluminous white dress. Unfortunately, I have not yet located any resources which document Willie's own feelings and experiences. This scrapbook is one of many preserved in the collection of the Broward County Historical Archives, created by Abbey as well as Anne Palmer Sheldon, to document what these women believed to be their benevolent work for the Florida Seminole, in leadership roles in Broward County women's groups, such as chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, and women-led organizations, such as the Friends of the Seminole, from the 1940s through the early 1960s. Filled with articles, photos, and thank you letters, these scrapbooks illustrate how these women organized clothing, schooling, sewing lessons, Boys and Girl Scout troops, home economics programs, and home loans for Seminole people. While their playful hand-decorated covers underscore these women's activities as recreational, the scrapbooks bear witness to the centrality of white women in settler projects of schooling, dressing, housing, and domestic education of Seminole people in this period. In this paper, I focus on the role of clothing and sewing in their projects and argue that, ultimately, these programs intended to assimilate Native people of Florida, and that these women were agents of settler colonialism, by which I mean the ongoing system of colonization enacted in the United States, in which outsiders invade a land with an intention to settle there permanently and displace those native to it through political, economic, and cultural means, including genocide, assimilation, and deterritorialization. These women enacted a particularly gendered mode of settler colonialism, meant to impose heteropatriarchal gender roles and structures of relations on a historically matrilineal culture. I draw on Seminole material culture, oral histories, and other first-person sources to access the experiences and agency of those subject to these assimilative projects. My framing is influenced by Native thinkers working in Indigenous studies and educational research who argue the complicity of white women in American expansionism, such as Sandy Grandy in her 2005 article, White Stream Feminism and the Colonialist Project, and the research challenges set out by Arvin Meiling, Eve Tuck, and Angie Morrill for non-Native scholars in 2013's Decolonizing Feminism, challenging connections between settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy. The people I refer to as Seminole in this paper descend from Native American peoples who historically inhabited homelands in Georgia, Alabama, and parts of the greater Southeast, and migrated to Florida due to settler encroachment in the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as peoples indigenous to the territories now known as Florida. Today, there are two federally recognized tribes of people historically called Seminole in Florida, the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians, as well as independent Seminole communities who refuse political recognition by the settler state. Native people have lived throughout Florida for centuries. In its extended aggressions of the mid-19th century, known as the Seminole Wars, the United States sought to rid the area highlighted in dark green on the top left map here, of its native populations through genocide and forced migration to Indian Territory, where today a third federally recognized tribe of Seminole people, the Seminole Nation, has lands. Those people who survived and remained following the wars largely isolated themselves in the watery ecosystem of Big Cypress Swamp and Everglades of the interior of southern Florida, inaccessible to settlers. Their lifeways were structured by its ecology. Extended families lived together in palm-thatched chickees with raised platform floors and camps. They traveled by canoes through ancestral waterways. They subsisted on its plants and hunted and fished animals also dependent on the watery ecosystem. And occasionally they traded exotic bird feathers, frogs, and pelts to traders at the peninsular coasts for fabric, tools, and other goods. In the 1910s, state and private business interests began draining these areas on a large scale to develop Florida for agriculture, urbanization, and population growth. The ecological change created by drainage decimated subsistence lifeways. Consequently, Seminole relationships to the US government and Florida settlers shifted. Seminoles began working in tourist camps and as laborers on commercial farms, began utilizing Bureau health services and job programs, and some moved to Bureau trust lands, such as the Dania Reservation, which is now called Hollywood. The larger map here shows current reservations. While the Bureau had long encouraged Seminole residency on these lands, which they claimed to be safe from settler encroachment, in actuality, these small reservations were designed to vacate the greater historical Florida Native Territory to further state and settler development. In the late 1940s, following World War II, the federal government moved to cut its Indian services, initiating the termination era. Termination policies aimed to halt Bureau programs and dismantle the reservation system. Advocates framed these policies as encouraging self-sufficiency, but ultimately their effects would force assimilation, destabilize tribal identity, and void historical treaty agreements. In 1954 Senate hearings, reservation-based Seminoles petitioned for 25 more years of federal services before termination. At the time, Seminoles were impoverished due to the destruction of traditional subsistence lifeways and the limited economic opportunities available under systemic settler discrimination, and few spoke English or had settler educations. As Billy Osceola, a Baptist lay minister and cattle owner on Brighton Reservation, testified, quote, "These Indians want more time to get better education in that period of 25 years. At that time, the Indians want to take over. They don't want to turn it over to some other organization. They want to control it. They want to handle their own affairs," end quote. Abby and Sheldon also traveled to Washington to testify against termination at these hearings in an attempt to, in fact, handle Seminole affairs. The senators commended their work and recognized their expertise and authority as allies. While the male senators pushed the state policy work of termination, Abby and Sheldon did the women's work of tending to Seminole children and their assimilation. When Abby and Sheldon said the Seminoles needed 25 more years, they were asserting that their work of assimilation was not yet done, but that they intended to complete it. Abby had begun working to integrate Seminole children into settler educational systems in 1934 as a member of the Friends of the Seminole. She escorted students to boarding school in Cherokee, North Carolina, and fundraised for their expenses and clothing. Like earlier residential schools, the Cherokee Indian School required that its students dress in settler clothing, attend church, and receive occupational training as part of their education. As Betty Mae Jumper described, quote, "We're in the schoolroom for a half day. The other half of the day was spent going to such classes as sewing, cooking, basket making, pottery making, and learning how to clean house and keep it clean," end quote. Teaching gendered domestic skills was equally important to formal schooling within the boarding school system, demonstrating the imposition of heteropatriarchal gender roles and training Native children for occupations with limited economic potential, such as domestic work and craft making, as primary goals of settler education. Following the closure of Cherokee School, Abby petitioned to integrate Seminole children from the Dania Reservation into Broward County Public Schools. She prepared Seminole children for school by teaching them basic English, the Pledge of Allegiance, the use of flush toilets and sinks, and getting them new clothes and shoes to wear. Her support went from kindergarten through college and included acting as their PTA representative and as a classroom aide. The organizations she worked for focused their fundraising on disrobing these children, removing signifiers of their settler identity and dressing them as settler children. A solicitation from the Friends of the Seminole clearly asks, are you interested in the Seminole youth becoming Americanized and taking their place as citizens of Florida, end quote. To support this mission, donors were asked to contribute to the purchase of clothing for Seminole children to wear to school. The Friends of the Seminole explicitly link Americanization with educating and redressing these children, and by extension, deseminolizing them. Accounts I have read of this first generation of Seminoles to attend Broward County Public Schools generally portray their experiences positively. Regardless, Abby and her organization's boosterism for settler schooling for Seminole children attempted to alienate Seminole children from their culture, families, and nation. Schools enforced English language use, supporting loss of their language. Schools required Seminoles children wear settler-style clothing, establishing their own culturally distinct clothing as improper in settler contexts. Schools privileged settler pedagogy and modeled behavior. Schools and these women's organizations worked to Americanize Seminole through these methods and by requiring a pledge of allegiance, which did not acknowledge the Seminole children's allegiance to their own sovereign nations. Sheldon and the Oakland Park Women's Club developed another clothing-based program of assimilation. They led sewing schools on the Dania Reservation. Numerous oral histories and ethnographic accounts attest that Seminole children learned to sew from Seminole relatives at a young age. For instance, in a more recent interview from 2000, Brian Cepeda spoke of his grandmother teaching his daughter to sew when she was just 2.5. Seminole garment sewing techniques and patchwork designs were taught generation to generation within clans, and patchwork technique, which Seminoles innovated in the late 1910s, is considered a protected cultural knowledge. Seminole fashion is at once conservative and innovative, developing with continuity to earlier designs. Women's clothing changed in silhouette, as illustrated on this chart on the left, but also materials and techniques, such as transitions from applique to patchwork, use of calicos and solids, and changes in ornamentation from fringe to ruffles to rich rickrack. The women's club classes disrupted traditional making and systems of education by teaching these students, who already knew how to sew Seminole garments, to use settler patterns to make clothing tailored in Euro-American methods. According to a Miami Herald article highlighting these classes, the Seminole girls were taught to, quote, make dresses like their classmates because no little girl likes to dress differently than her friends, end quote. From the limited information available in the scrapbook, this meant more fitted dresses and blouses with collars and buttons up the front, as well as undergarments such as slips. But from these outfits in the photo on the right here, it is evident to me that the girls infused Seminole design into these newly learned patterns. In a 1959 article Sheldon preserved, one of the sewing students, Priscilla Doctor, is highlighted as, quote, a typical US teenager. There are no Seminole skirts in her wardrobe, end quote. Doctor is pictured with a short haircut, a thin metallic chain necklace, and a white tank top within an indistinct background. Her image is paired with one of Mrs. Jimmy Osceola, wearing a traditional cape, hairstyle, and beaded necklaces, and posed in front of a chickie, like the woman in the opening postcard. To the Miami Herald's writer, Doctor embodies the future of Seminole in settler-style clothes, hairstyle, and jewelry, while Osceola holds on to doomed traditions. Note the violence with which the author characterizes this change, the use of the word dying, the phrase modernity scalping tradition. He correlates physical violence and cultural change, acknowledging two primary modes of settler colonialism. Despite these programs aimed to assimilate Seminole children with harmful individual, cultural, and social impacts, Seminoles have been able to draw on these experiences to strengthen Seminole culture in their ongoing work of decolonization while under active colonization. For young Seminole women in these classes, settler tailoring was a means of coping within the system of settler schooling in which they were thrust, while it also spurred their creativity and built their confidence. From this time, Seminole fashion has celebrated innovations which integrate traditional Seminole sewing with other design and tailoring traditions. Shown off at fashion shows at the annual Seminole Tribal Fair and Powwow, these fashions do not signify assimilation, but rather survivance and cultural distinction. They integrate settler elements to create dynamic and powerful Seminole fashions. As said by Miccosukee Reverend Houston R. Cypress, patchwork, quote, is a symbol of survival. Patchwork mirrors the resilient strategies of our people's beautiful struggle, end quote. Similarly, Seminole people have utilized settler schooling to support Seminole sovereignty. For example, education in settler systems enabled the careful reading of federal law, which led the Seminole tribe to pursue high-stakes gambling, eventually upheld by the Supreme Court following challenges by the state of Florida, in a decision which allowed tribes throughout the country to operate casinos. From this decision, the Seminole tribe built its hard rock empire and used its profits to support the renewal of the Seminole tribe, such as by educating children in Seminole language and culture, protecting lands, and otherwise aiding healing from the impacts of settler colonialism. Returning to the projects of Abby and Sheldon, the histories they created in their scrapbooks center themselves and their organizations as benevolent leaders in Seminole progress. In actuality, their projects aimed, student by student, family by family, to assimilate the Seminole into settler society, to deconstruct Seminole family and clan systems, and to alienate people from traditional housing and fashion, and from the language and from allegiance to their people, as I will explore more thoroughly in my larger research work. It could be comfortable to condone Abby and Sheldon and their colleagues' actions as well-intentioned good works by the standard of their times and of their society. Attendant to the first challenge of Arbin, Tuck, and Morrell to, quote, problematize and theorize the intersections of settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and heteropaternalism, end quote, I argue that yes, in fact, they were working in line with the goals of the settler state at their time. They served the US policy of termination. My project aims to draw from the history these women constructed in their scrapbooks, supported by settler media, and unsettle the narratives they created by identifying the impacts of settler colonialism on the Seminole people subject to their programs, highlighting Americanization as assimilation and acculturation, and by exposing these women as complicit in the settler colonialist project, and by advancing a discourse connecting settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy through concrete local examples of Seminole education, redressing, and domestic training. Seminole women, though, have refused this assimilative violence and drawn strength from strategically appropriating elements of settler culture. This is demonstrated by the Seminole women I've cited in this paper who used their Seminole educations to lead their tribes. Betty Mae Jumper, who attended the Cherokee School, went on to become the second Seminole tribal chairperson. Priscilla Doctor, the young woman highlighted as a typical US teenager in the Miami Herald article, represented the tribe as Miss Florida Seminole 1964 while proudly wearing patchwork, and served as secretary and treasurer for the Seminole tribe of Florida for 35 years. And this continues to be demonstrated by many Seminole and Miccosukee women since. Thank you.
I would love to just dive right into the questions because we don't have too much time left. It looks like we have about 11 minutes. And okay, do we have, I-Fen, may I ask you to turn your camera on? And let me just dive in, take advantage of the time we have. So I'll start with some questions posed to Kelli. One person is wondering if the students first learned to write the quote with pen and ink before doing the stitch work.
Thank you for that question. It is a good one. I have not found any evidence of that to date, but I will be on the lookout for it in the future because we know that they were learning these texts, biblical and literary, in school as well. So yes, that's a good question, and it will be something that I look for in the future. Thank you.
And then just a couple more for you that I think are fairly quick answers. One question is about the photo with Olivia Rebecca Parker. The question is asking, or saying that their peers are students of many ages. And the question is, do you know how the classes are structured as far as age and skill level?
I do not know, and I'm sorry. I do apologize for the confusion. That photo is just a placement photo. It is actually from the 1890s, so later than when Olivia Rebecca Parker was in school. That photo was, I believe, it's from a blog post by Barbara Cerruti, where she is talking about 19th century women sewing. And I believe in her post, she said it was from the Agricultural and Mechanical College in South Carolina. So that would have been women around the same, like college age. But going back to Olivia Rebecca Parker and the records for that school, that is something I will be looking into to see if there are records for the Lombard Street School. So I will be able to hopefully answer that question in the future.
Thank you. And then just one last follow-up. There's a question about the Harris sampler and what the top line says.
Oh, extract, which was a common, if they took a verse from a literary text, that's the term that they would often put at the top to show that this is only one piece of a larger work.
Thank you. A question for Kate. They're asking about the image with the family darning together and including young boys, and wondering if that was unusual.
Yeah, it was actually just complete fabrication. It was to sell the idea of this darning competition, which had great didactic intent and was very do-gooding. But yeah, that probably would not have happened. Although, that families would possibly darn together. I just haven't seen anything like that image in real life.
And then another one for you, Kate. Can you talk about the popular trend of visible mending that's happening now in support of slow fashion? And can you say whether that's influenced your research?
Yes, I think. This is my new book, Mend, a Refashioning Manual and Manifesto. I should know that title by heart. Penguin, it's not academic, it's for everyone. Yes, I'm very, very involved in a bit of visible mending, and yes, it's influenced my research, and to me, it's all part of the same research project, really. There's a contemporary element, and that is happening in, as Kate Irvin very well knows, in the contemporary discourse. There is quite a lot going on, but the historical part, not so much, but very much visible mending is the continuation of a long, long, long history, and I think it's very important. In fact, I'm presenting on this tomorrow. Forgot to mention, I forget the session, 1:30, I think, session tomorrow, if you're interested.
Great, thank you. A question for I-Fen. There's a question about the kind of school that you're talking about. I think that might be referring to the, kind of like how was the school structured?
The school that I talked about, the Puzi Girls School, it's a public school that was for female students only, and it's during the colonial Taiwan period. So not too many students attend the school, but most of them are of probably more wealthy family background. So in some interview that were done like decades later, when these students all have turned maybe in their 60s or even 70s, they still recall vividly about the embroidery class that they had with the painter Meiling and their embroidery teacher. But the school is a public school that was established by the Japanese government during the colonial period for Taiwanese students only.
So there's a question that kind of follows up on that, and it's actually addressed to both you, I-Fen, and to Kate. And the question is asking you to talk about the social class in this work, and then Kate, many upper and middle class New York women would have had servants, for example.
Yeah, really good question. That is surprisingly many higher up the social scale, surprisingly many women did their own stocking mending because it was so associated with morality to a great extent. It's a long story, but it's very interesting to look into that. And yeah, there certainly would have been servants, but there was, the servant problem was very alive at that point. So servants and good ones were hard to come by. And that was something else that fed into it. I don't want to take up too much time.
And let's see, for Darden, there's a question, how can we best help the girls of Malawi? Should we donate to D2D?
So one of the best ways to help is that young girls don't have access to going. If they pass the exams, they can't pay to go to school. So paying for high school, because it has to be paid for, is the greatest thing. $600 a year for a child to go to school, to high school. $600. It costs $2,000 total for a young person to go to college in this part of Malawi. So every amount contributes, and you can designate particular ways to do that. You can sponsor a student, a female student, and you can ask that it be a female student that you sponsor through D2D. So go to determinetodevelop.org and consider sponsoring a kid. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another, it was actually a question in the chat asking if you could repost or share somehow the resources slide. So the last slide that you had in your talk.
My references?
Yes, references, yeah.
Sure. They will also all be in the paper too. But I guess I can put them in the chat.
I guess, yeah, you can do that.
Thank you.
Thing that you could do, if I can just jump in, especially because I know we're just about out of time, and these were all amazing presentations, and I see so many questions that I would like to hear answered. You can use that activity stream function in the app. That's a place where people are sharing a lot of photos, and that's a way that, if you have something you want to share, you can put that out publicly, and also get in touch with each other using the attendee directory and the messages.
And there's one more question for you, Darden. The Chitenges have an interesting history in Southern Africa. Do you know anything about where they were, where the ones you used were sourced or produced?
Actually, and that's a layer of complexity that truly needs to be explored. It's a paper in and of itself, because they are a form of they become a form of oppression in the way that they are mass produced. And these in particular that we use were from Nigeria. That's where the majority of them are coming in, although they are also produced off the continent and brought back to the continent.
Thank you. Amanda, someone is asking you to elaborate on Empire in your reference to Seminole hard rock empire. Do they own hard rocks outside of Southern Florida?
In fact, yeah, they own the entire Hard Rock brand. So every Hard Rock cafe and casino restaurant around the world is owned by the Seminole tribe of Florida.
And then there's a comment from Beverly Gordon that's addressed to you, Amanda. She says, you talk about traditional Seminole clothing, but that's something of a mistaken concept in itself, since the patchwork tradition with colored cotton only came in as trade materials in the first place. I believe it's important to acknowledge the concept of authentication and the evolving nature of tradition. I just wanted you to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, like the evolving nature of tradition. So I think she's getting at sort of when things do become traditional. And so patchwork came about in the 1910s. Trade fabric became integrated in Seminole clothing in the 19th century. And there really is a tremendous continuity from garment construction in sort of in hides to trade fabric, in the techniques used from, as I, one of my slides had, you know, a garment with both applique and patchwork. And so I think there's a tremendous continuity between the way that applique was used in garments to the way that patchwork became used in garments once the sewing machine really enabled all new decorative elements. And so it was an innovation, patchwork in the 1910s, but it really spoke very clearly and continuously to historical decorative techniques on clothing and also garment assembly. So, yeah.
Thank you. So there are so many other questions that I too would love to see answered, but I'm afraid that we are 2 minutes past 12. I think so. We are 2 minutes past our time limit. But I would encourage you to be in touch with all of our presenters. I think we all know how to access, and we can we'll distribute the specific questions individually as well. Thank you so much, everybody. This was really wonderful.